Shalom, I am Tirsa Lewis with the Echad Israeli Beit Midrash. This is a lesson for women. We will be looking at the season we are in, sowing season, and connecting that with the virtuous woman, Proverbs 31, the Echad, and we will be looking at maximizing our increase. I was thinking recently about how we are so disconnected from an agricultural or even a gardening society. I'm personally used to going to grocery stores to buy my produce, and the new move is that, we'll be able to start ordering our groceries online and they'll just show up at our front doors. So in the future, it's likely that we will find ourselves even more disconnected from understanding the seasons and how they consequently relate to our ancient Israelite culture. When we look at the holy days, they had a agricultural significance. So when we're looking at the Feast of Sukkot, it was also called the Feast of Ingathering, or Echad. And it was a time when the last harvest would be gathered for the year. It was a time of thanksgiving. It was a time of celebrating the harvest, but it was also a time of preparation of the ground for the winter sowing season. And for that, we needed to have the early or the autumn rains. The 7th month of our Hebrew calendar is called the month of Tishri. However, in the scriptures, it's called Etanim. When we look at 1 Kings 8 verse 2, it says, "And all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon in the month of Etanim, which is the 7th month." When we look at the Hebrew word Etanim, it means constant flowings. And Etanim, the 7th month, is called the month of constant flowings because the dry riverbeds would again fill with water. The early rains of Etanim, or these autumn rains of Etanim, were essential to softening up the ground so that our forefathers could go out and plow and sow wheat and barley seeds for the next year. Plowing and sowing could not take place until the ground was sufficiently softened by the rain. And sowing season was traditionally between October through December. We can see how the softening of the ground was essential to the harvest for the next year, because the grains planted after Sukkot would be the first harvest of the new year. That would be the barley and the wheat. And these was the offerings that we would have at our spring celebrations of Passover and HaBikurim, the Feast of First Fruits, and Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. In this sowing season that we are in, it's important that we look at ourselves on a spiritual level and examine the ground, which is our hearts. Have our hearts been sufficiently softened by the spiritual rains of the 7th month? Or is our ground still hardened? Think back to the Day of Atonement. Have you forgiven the unforgivable? Or are you still holding on to bitterness? Have you let go of all the sins or any weights that so easily beset us? Think about Sukkot. Have you fully rejoiced in Yahweh? And have you endured any wilderness tests that you may have faced with a smile? How do we maximize the increase of our harvest? We need to think about these things. We need to think about how are we going to maximize the increase of our yield, our increase, our ground. How are we going? Clearly, we must begin with good ground, because the seed, which is the word of Yah, is already good. And the rain, which is the Ruach of Yah, is already good. So now we must examine ourselves and see if we are good ground. I wrote a note to myself during Sukkot, and I asked myself, am I in the green or am I in the red? And when we look at the woman of Proverbs, or the Echad, or the virtuous woman, the prevailing image of her is a woman who brings increase. She brings a yield. So if there's something that's in the red or in the green, she's in the green. Proverbs 31 verse 11 says, "The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain." The NIV for this says, "Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value." When I think of full confidence from a business standpoint, I think of an employee that has the full confidence of his boss to do the job that's been delegated to him, to fulfill or to handle his position. And so the Echad, the virtuous woman, her husband has full confidence in her that she is going to add to his situation and not take away from it. The Echad brings forth increase. She brings forth addition. She brings forth multiplication. She brings forth fruit. She brings forth a yield. Proverbs 31 verse 31 says, "Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates." This is the final verse of Proverbs 31. And we know that each of the verses of Proverbs 31 is an acrostic, so it begins with the succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so the last verse, give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates, that this is the Hebrew letter Tav, which is a mark. And so her mark, her name, right, her mark, her lasting mark is that she has produce, she has fruit. And that fruit is an indicator of who she is. The blessing of fruit or produce is one of the blessings of obedience. Leviticus 26 verses 3-5 says, "If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And your threshing shall reach into the vintage, and the vintage shall reach into the sowing time, and ye shall eat your bread to the full, and dwell in your land safely." So we could see here in these verses how the blessing of obedience is that one agricultural season will lead into the next and into the next. Your yield will be so abundant and so great that you won't finish the activities of the first season before the next season begins. This is also true of the world to come, or the Olam Haba, which Amos says in Amos 9 verse 13, "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seeds. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt." So we can see that when the ground is good, when we are in a spiritual position of being right before the Almighty and being in good relationship with Him, that He blesses us with increase. He blesses us with produce, with fruit. But the ground has to be ready. And I'm not making up that the ground is our heart. We can look at what Mashiach said about this in Matthew chapter 13, verses 3-9. It says, "And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. And others fell upon the rocky places, where they did not have much soil. And immediately they sprang up, because there was no depth. They had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. And others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear." Now, I don't have to go through explaining this in my own words, because Yeshua himself gives the explanation in Matthew chapter 13, verses 18-23. It says, "Hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. And the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." Listen to this. "And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, This is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And what I want to focus on here is that even the good ground produces levels of increase. He said that he who hears the word and is good ground and understands it or comprehends it, that some will bring forth 100-fold, some 60-fold, and some 30-fold when it's time for the harvest. Now let's think about the Echad. Let's think about the virtuous woman. What is her increase? Is it 30-fold? Is it 60-fold? Or is it 100-fold? Proverbs 31 verse 29 says, many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. She exceeds all expectations of her. So we can't just look at us as being good ground and producing an increase, but we need to look at maximizing that increase, maximizing that yield, being those that produce 100-fold rather than those that produce 30-fold. How do we utilize this time to maximize our increase? Clearly, we have a role to play in the increase. Yah provides the good seed of his word. He provides the good rain of his ruach. But we must be ground that receives that seed, that receives that rain, and that allows that word to take root in us. And this is yielding to the work that he is doing on the inside of us. Let's utilize this sowing season to be attentive to the leading and guiding of Yahweh in our life and to draw close to him by heeding to his word. Let's be ready for the transformation to take place so that we will have an abundance of fruit in the spring harvest. And when we have an abundance of fruit, we are able to give. In ancient Israel, when it was time to reap, the Torah commands that we should not, glean the corn, that we should leave the corners of our field for the poor. Leviticus 23 verse 22 says, and when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest. Neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger. This is why in Proverbs 31 it says to give her of the fruit of her hands, because she has taken care of this responsibility to leave some for the poor. Proverbs 31 verse 20 says, she stretches her hands out to the poor. Yea, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. Those who are spiritually mature are those who are able to help those who are in need. But if I'm in need of help, how can I help someone else? That's the blind leading the blind, and we know where that's going to end up. Let's be those women who are virtuous and who bring about an increase, who lead by example, and who are changed and transformed by that Ruach rain into good ground. Let's receive that good word. Let's bring forth an abundant amount of fruit. In this sowing season, let's focus on maximizing the increase to be a blessing to our families, to be a blessing to our communities, and to be a blessing to all those who are in need. Hallelujah. Again, my name is Tirza Lewis. If you have any comments, you could leave them in the comment section of this video. If you would like to leave me a note by email, my email address is directechad.oneway@gmail.com. Our website is www.directechad.com. Shalom and Yahweh bless.